All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started, and people can join then as they need to. You know what? Okay. All right. So welcome everybody, and my name is Jenny Bhatt, and I am moderating this panel today, which is called Reading the World, and it's a discussion about how we read today and how we can aim to read more inclusively from a global literary canon. So let me introduce the panelists real quick, and then we'll start to go around the room. Dr. Elizabeth Russ grew up, and if you can just wave, Elizabeth, she grew up in the DFW area. After graduating from Pomona College in California, she taught bilingual kindergarten in Dallas ISD for 2 years before going to New York, where she did her PhD at Columbia. Currently, she's an associate professor of Spanish at SMU, where she chairs the Department of World Languages and Literatures, and she teaches courses on Latin American literature and culture, as well as a class about the city of Dallas. She's published scholarly articles on Dominican and Dominican American writers, transnationalism and trans-American literary themes and tropes, among other topics. And her book, The Plantation in the Post-Slavery Imagination, examines the plantation, that physical place most vividly associated with slavery in the Americas, as a rhetorical, ideological, and psychological trope through which intersecting histories of the New World have been told. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
And next we have Will. Will Evans is a publisher. He's a Russian to English translator and an entrepreneur. In 2013, Will founded Deep Vellum Publishing, a nonprofit indie book publisher dedicated to translating the world's best novels into English for American audiences. He's also founded Deep Vellum Books in early 2016, a brick and mortar bookstore and cultural community center in Dallas's historic Deep Ellum neighborhood. He's got 2 Bachelor of Arts degrees from Emory University in history and Russian language and literature and culture, I beg your pardon. And he has a Master's of Arts in Russian culture from Duke University. So welcome, Will. And then Joyce Sáenz Harris is a Texas writer and former newspaper journalist. She's worked at the Corpus Christi Caller-Times and the Boston Globe. She spent more than 25 years as a features editor and writer at the Dallas Morning News, and she's been a regular reviewer and interviewer for the Sunday Book Pages since 2009. And her writing has also appeared in Texas Highways, Latina, and other venues. And just very quickly about me, I'm the moderator today. I'm a writer, translator, a book critic. I teach at Writing Workshops Dallas, and I'm the host of the Desi Books podcast, which looks at South Asian literature. And I had a short story collection out last year titled Each of Us Killers in the US, and a literary translation from Gujarati to English, which was out in India, and hopefully will be out next year in the US as well. And I've written book reviews for places like NPR, Washington Post, and essays at Literary Hub and Longreads, and I live in a suburb of Dallas. So that's us. What I'd like to do, because I know we're short of time as well, so what I'd like to do is maybe first, by way of introduction, just go around to the panelists and ask each one of them to share their personal definition of global literature. How do you see it from where you sit as an academic, a publisher, and a book critic? And we'll go in that order if that's okay. So Elizabeth, if you could go.
Sure. Absolutely. So, I was thinking about this question, and I think I want to say that there are sort of 3 ways that I would define global literature for myself. And the first is just, really generally, okay, global literature is literature from around the world, often read in translation, often read by people because we're interested in learning about other parts of the world and interested in reading good stories, right? As an academic, when we talk about global literature, or more often world literature, there are all kinds of debates around world literature. How does it compare to comparative literature, which would be more, reading literature in its original language and making these very erudite comparisons based on national literary traditions. Debates about, well, should you even read literature in translation? Should you teach literature in translation? What does literature lose when it's translated? What does it gain? I know I see Will, these translation debates, but there are also a lot of debates about markets, about access, about who gets translated and why, and who gets publicized and why. So all of these sorts of debates around world literature in an academic context. And then the other thing that I'm really interested in is thinking about a practice of reading global literature. How can we approach this kind of adventurous type of reading in almost an ethical way? What are the ethics of reading global literature, and how do we relate to and confront an other that we read on the page? So that would be my personal definition.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of food for thought there, and some of the things that I've also been grappling with, because when I talk about global literature, I maybe have a slightly different definition just as a reader and a writer. Yeah. Will, how about you as a publisher?
I love hearing the academic questions behind this, because it reminds me of why I started Deep Vellum, which is maybe to try and tear down a lot of those walls, because I definitely ran into them as a reader. And when I began studying Russian literature as a 17-year-old college student, once upon a time, I was told never study literature in translation if you can't help it, because you have to get to the original. And this is a pretty old school Russian literary way of teaching literature that I do not agree with at all. And I think that literature in translation, and the goal of Deep Vellum, is to try and smash down all the walls between nation states and cultures, to bring people together into some sort of Tower of Babel, this mythological place in which we can all converse through literature and storytelling and find a way to celebrate our shared humanity rather than to celebrate the divisions between us or to try and create false divisions. And but to that effect, the questions that Elizabeth just posited are sort of what guide us. And if we do have this internationalist approach to global literature, then Deep Vellum's approach is that we started doing translated literature, which in America is usually what means world literature or global literature. And we want to actually take the idea that American literature and Dallas writers are as much a part of global literature as writers who write in other languages and cultures originally. And then how does that differ? And then how do we work through diasporas in the way that people move across states and languages and time? And in the Russian canon, this is maybe brought about best by a character like Nabokov, who famously wrote many books in Russian, French, and English that are completely different. He's three completely different writers in three different languages. How many people do we all know personally who do that? I know a lot. I'm sure Jenny does for sure. And it's just this really interesting idea that if you write in English originally, you're as much a part of the world canon as someone who writes in Gujarati originally. And if you can get that Gujarati work back in English, then the dialogue can happen on this level. But is there a way to get the English into the Gujarati context too, in all the languages of the world, and to celebrate the way we're all different, but the way we're all together? And that's what language and literature, and that's why Deep Vellum does what we do. And that's why we publish from so many languages and cultures compared to a lot of other publishers. But it is not a common experience in the American publishing landscape, let alone in the world. So we have a lot of work to do, but it does bring great joy to find these conversations and these similarities.
Yes, they certainly are very rich and textured conversations. Joyce, you review books, and you're reviewing different books from different cultures sometimes. How do you see global literature from where you sit?
I have a very simple definition, which it's not very academic. It's pretty much from the point of a viewer who is way more monolingual than I would like to be. But I really just see it as any literature that brings another culture into our lives, and it reveals another part of the earth as part of our shared human experience. And insofar as translation goes, as I'm sure the rest of the panel knows very well, there's actually more of it going on now, possibly than ever before. And I have just been very impressed that my little part of the world, the the newspaper industry and so on, that the big book sections that are still around, and there aren't that many of them anymore, but they are still trying to, have really made an effort to try to get more world literature, global lit, and also more books translated from the original language into the eyeballs of potential readers. You probably know that the New York Times has started a quarterly roundup called Globetrotting. And what it does is bring scores of new books to the attention of New York Times readers. Every quarter, they have a roundup. The one in December had 83 books from around the world that were coming out in translation this spring. So I think that's a wonderful trend. And I hope that we're going to continue to see more of that.
Yes, same into that. I'm going to skip real quick to another question, because I think this one's kind of related to what each one of them have said. And that is, when we talk about global literature and the access, to works from different parts of the world, and the visibility now, as Joyce mentioned, from places like the New York Times. But if we look at how globalization across the world is changing what and how we read, what do you all see in terms of, are even more literary works falling through the cracks and getting neglected because of social media echo chambers and, book publicity hype machines? Or are you seeing better visibility, awareness, and access because, the internet has sort of leveled the playing field perhaps a little bit? Where do you stand on that debate, and what do you see? Elizabeth, we'll start again with you. Okay.
All right. I almost feel like it's a both and, right? I do think that, with the expanse of more things being translated, there is more availability. I think that, in many things with the internet, right, we're able to find out about things that we maybe didn't find out about before. So I think that there is both that, and then there's also that danger always with globalization that you have something happen to books like happens to coffee shops, right? Everything turns into Starbucks. Only, certain things get through to the mainstream, and a lot of things get blocked out. But I think that, things like Deep Vellum, things like this roundup that the New York Times is doing, these are endeavors that do try to smash down those walls, as Will said, and try to open things up. I know that, for me, for example, there's a writer from the Dominican Republic that I adore. Her name is Rita Indiana, and she's been translated. Like 3 of her novels have been translated, so I can teach her not just in my Spanish language classes, but in the general kind of Latin American literature and translation classes that I teach. So those opportunities exist that I think didn't exist maybe even 10 or 15 years ago. So I kind of am more optimistic than pessimistic.
Excellent. Yes. Will, how about you?
This is the $1 million question. I actually don't know if I'm an optimist or a pessimist about this. And the more I've gone with Deep Vellum, I'm a little bit pessimistic, even as I've contributed greatly to some of the numbers that you've mentioned, as well as some of the bringing up languages that have never had books translated into English and countries and whatnot, right? Because one of the problems we've had is that historically in American publishing, there was a much better era in terms, not just in the number of translated books published, but in the number of copies that they sold. And then, of course, there is this false dichotomy in this thought that better sales means better readers. So I do always hope that the books find their readers. And as a publisher, we would like our books to sell as many copies as they can so that they can find the readers. I don't think that every sale means a reader. Do you know what I mean? I'm not that kind of guy. But we were set up as a nonprofit publishing house to publish the books that fall through the cracks of commercial publishing. And in America, the publishing structure is dominated by 5 large publishing houses. We call them the Big 5 in the industry, and they control 90% of what's published in America. But more than what's published, they control the entire distribution and book marketing network. They have created every single one of the silos that you've mentioned as possible, problems. And I do not have any love lost for that aspect of this business. I think that 90% of the books published in America every year are garbage and don't actually deserve to be published. And I think we need to focus on quality literature and quality storytelling, not in an old white European male sense of the word. We need to build a better, more inclusive literary canon that includes writers from all over. But I don't think that the quality of what's published out there is actually what I should be focused on, right? If people publish bad books and people read bad books, that's a problem to me, but not writ large, because people are reading, people are talking and whatever. However, the problem is it is harder than ever for good books to find their readers, because reading as an art form is being lost through time, right? We have very short attention spans. We're being completely, stuff is being thrown at us every time we look at our phones or turn on the TV or just turn on a car. You are getting inundated with information and noise and entertainment in a way in which books are it's always a slippery argument. It has been for hundreds of years. Like, people aren't reading enough books, book sales are low. This always existed. It's still a problem, and it always will be. But then the real question that I have, I guess let's focus on the optimistic side, which is a publisher like Deep Vellum could start up in Dallas in 2013. And thanks to social media and the way that information gets out there now, our books get reviewed in the New York Times, and our books are featured in Globetrotting and all these positive things. We became a facet of the publishing industry immediately on the same level as publishers who've been around for 100 years, thanks in large part to the digital revolution and the way that we can share information and engage with the readers. I've seen a lot of readers. I went and looked at everyone who's here. Hello to friends in New York. Hello to friends from overseas. Hello to friends all over Texas. That's amazing. This is part of what has allowed us to have any success. It's what has also allowed us to look at the world and read more samples and submissions and meet publishers without just having to travel to international book fairs, and without only waiting for submissions to come to us. We can go seek out new voices. And so the optimistic side of me is like, Globetrotting featured 83 books or 82 books in its recent feature. No one's going to read all 82 books, right? So then the problem is, as a publisher, how does your book, because we had 5 or something books in that feature, how do those 5 books of ours find their readers? Hopefully the Times will be similar, like, wow, I haven't read a book from Romania before. Maybe I'll pick it up, right? Because there's not exactly like long descriptions in there. But how do we find the connections? That connection is what drives us as a nonprofit publisher. Sales will come if we can find the way to connect. And thanks to the digital revolution, there are a lot of ways to connect now that are really amazing. It's really hard to compete, but it also has, like, the bottom is higher than it used to be. Whereas, like, the top is still, there's still a lot of problems, but there is a lot to celebrate. And I appreciate that.
Oh, that's encouraging to hear both you and Elizabeth say that. And Joyce, how about you?
I tend to agree with Will's more optimistic self, I guess. I think it's wonderful how fabulous that Deep Vellum is getting the national and international play that it should. And we can, I believe, credit a lot of this to the digital revolution. Globalization's changing what we read, primarily through, I believe, this type of knowledge that's getting out there, and also through the ebook and other electronic publishing formats. It makes culture more universally accessible, more affordable to people, and it speeds the spread of the written word. Now, granted, not everything that's out there is top drawer quality, but at the same time, you could also say that there's a place for popular literature, and part of that is also coming from translations. There are some really fun things out there for people who like to read a certain type of entertaining literature. I'm thinking particularly of sort of fantasy and science fiction. Believe it or not, it has a huge following. It isn't, generally speaking, not going to be called great literature, but for a lot of people, it's their favorite type of reading. And there's a lot of it now that's coming out from around the world. And I'm seeing a lot of it coming out from Spanish-speaking countries and from Asian countries. And there is a column that has begun running in the Washington Post. Ron Charles is he's the main book critic there. But for the Washington Post, they have gotten together a couple of writers. One is from Mexico, Silvia, Morena Garcia. And the other one is a guy from Israel whose name does not come immediately to my tongue. But the thing is that they've put together, they're starting to put together regular lists of books we need to pay attention to in our, beloved fantasy field. And that kind of imaginative literature is, it's a little different from what we call great world literature. And yet at the same time, it has an enormous audience. They're building, I hope, a backlog of people who, if they're going to explore these books, they might go on to explore some other kinds. And maybe if they start out reading Sylvia's great spooky Mexican Gothic novel, maybe they will go on and explore some other things. Maybe other writers, maybe other novels in other genres.
May I jump in with that?
Sorry, go ahead, Will.
So sorry, Jenny. I just wanted to follow up and say Joyce has hit on something really great, and that genre doesn't preclude literature. Literature is like a quality of writing to be in any genre. Genre writing has been historically one of the most inclusive ways of expressing art, and in the Russian context, and definitely not exclusively, genre is a way that you can push up against the boundaries of political and social taboos, laws, things that get you in a lot of trouble otherwise. And so as a result, in America as well, genre writing looks a lot more like America than literary fiction, if that's even a genre, right? And so I looked right over, I was like, top of my reading stack is this book by Samuel Delaney, who's certainly one of the greatest writers in the American canon. And you could just name all of them, and writers from every language of the world. Like, genre does not mean bad writing necessarily at all. But it is definitely a way to get access to a lot of really creative ways of shaping stories. And that's really what storytelling for us is about, is like pushing up against language and culture and where the friction can kind of come in there. And so genre is a really wonderful place to play with those ideas. And
yeah,
so
and
I love it.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead, finish your thought. Oh, right. No, I think I just want to add that the Washington Post thing that you just mentioned, Joyce, I remember reading that was sci-fi and fantasy. And I think it's Labiti there, if that's pronounced the right way.
Yes.
Yes. And they actually covered from, the latest column was sci-fi and fantasy from India.
They did.
A lot of people don't. Yeah, a lot of people.
The whole thing I had printed out here, and I was going to ask you, in fact, if you had seen that, because I thought that was so fabulous and I hope they do the same thing for other countries, languages.
Yeah, and that was a great feature. I was surprised to see it there. I was like, whoa, in the Washington Post, which is great. Yeah. So, talking about different genres, let me ask you this question, all of you, is how do you see reading more world literature, whether it's in translation or other genres, expanding our understanding and appreciation of different literary traditions? And how do you see these different traditions, influencing and enriching each other? So again, just sort of tagging onto the different genres question. Elizabeth, would you want to go with that first?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting question, and it gets to the core of that third sort of part of my definition, which is this kind of ethical approach to reading global literature, right? Like how, and it also touches on these academic debates, right? Well, you shouldn't read in translation, as Will learned about Russian literature, and you have to know all about the national history of the place where the literature came from. And I mean, I think that's an unrealistic expectation, and it would just shut down the idea of world literature. But I do think, so there's a Francophone Afro-Caribbean writer from Martinique. His name is Edward Glissant. And I really love him, but he has this idea of relation. So the poetics of relation. How do we read as the self? How do we read about the other, right? And so one of his main ideas within that context is this idea of opacity. You know, so if you think about opacity, and everyone has the right to opacity. Well, what does it mean to be opaque? Well, you're not really visible, but you're not really invisible either, right? There's something that you can see as when I'm looking at you, I see this, but I don't know quite what it is. And so this idea that when we're reading global literature, we should be, especially if it's, you know, if it's a good story, if it's not garbage literature, whether it's genre or something else, you know, it's something that we can connect to, we can relate to, but at the same time, we confront the fact that there's maybe also something that we don't understand. You know, that there's something there that we aren't able to completely relate to. And that moment of confrontation and respecting that difference and maybe getting curious about it and trying to learn more about it. I mean, I think that that's a big part of what world literature is, but you kind of have to do it with intention, right? You can't just bland it out and flatten it out and say, oh yeah, right. India is just like the United States, it's just like Martinique, it's just like, you know, wherever else. So I think that this is sort of the way that I try to think about it.
Yeah, no, and that reading the other, that just reminded me of Matthew Salater's book, Craft in the Real World, and he talks about, you know, how we approach the other, both as writers and as readers. Will, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, this is actually like a question that kind of cuts to the core of what we do here, you know, and it's one we regularly run into with what we do, because we're always trying to promote writers from many different literary traditions, and the books that we publish don't fall into one literary tradition at all. That's actually what's really exciting to me about world literature, is that there's so many different ways of telling stories, and that hopefully by publishing a diverse array of writers from a diverse array of places working in a diverse array of styles, that we can all glean different things on how stories can be told wherever they come from. And one of the things that's really problematic in publishing in America, not just in America, but especially in America, is this idea that American readers have to be told everything, that American readers are dumb, and that American readers couldn't read between the lines, and they won't go look up stuff themselves, and they won't move on to the next book and like do a little bit more research. And it's a little bit BS, right? And this idea that American readers are dumb is probably because they're being pandered to constantly by the powers that be, and we're being suppressed as readers, as an entire culture, and we're being neglected this wonderful diversity of styles and viewpoints from around the world and in our own country, right? If all these garbage books are coming out of New York by garbage writers living in New York, it's like, what are we as readers in Texas or New York gaining from this experience? This is obviously the tip of my passion. Like, this is where I really run into, I should slow down. But we do run into this often because we're never trying to and reading the other is a great question too, because how do we read the other without othering the other? You know, and then that's like the question that philosophically we ask ourselves constantly, like, can we promote this book as a Mexican feminist work without putting it into a Mexican feminist box? Can we make the box more inclusive? Can we bring more people into it? What does that mean? And then famously, like, obviously the more that books get translated, read, discussed, disseminated, the more that we're able to learn. And you can famously look at, like, let's say Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who's arguably the most famous fiction writer in translation in American history. And so you have his style that he said was influenced by two things: his magical realism and the canon that he influenced. One was the Mexican writer Juan Rulfo, we all know, right? Who wrote the book Pedro Páramo, which told Marquez that he could break free of the constraints of time and space. What a beautiful concept. But that allowed him that he could write the world of Macondo, right? Okay, that's cool. So a Colombian writer reading a Mexican writer allows him to create a new tradition. And then in the tradition he's creating within Macondo, he has always said the writer that influenced him the most greatly was Faulkner, right? And so you have this American writer influencing this Colombian writer who's getting a style from a Mexican writer. That's world literature in a nutshell. You could name every single one of us is but a composite of all that we've read and experienced before us, right? Racism is not built in you when you're born. It's taught to you through a life. And part of the racism that's built into American culture is this pandering, this demeaning of cultures, of the idea that anything other than some, pantheon of white New York literary tradition is the only story worth telling. And like that stuff, that's where you run into the real negative friction at the edge of our culture. And that is what we're all out to do on this panel. Is obviously, I haven't been on a panel with people. I'm just like, I want to hug all of you once we're all vaccinated. It's going to be great. But that beauty of the intercultural play between styles, that's really, I love it.
Yeah, and you mentioned Marquez being influenced, and it reminded me, Salman Rushdie has said how his Midnight's Children, he was heavily influenced by Marquez. So, I mean, you talk about world literature, he's writing about India and, post-partition, and he was influenced by this, Colombian writer. So, yeah. Joyce, how about you?
I do think that reading more literature in translation enables even the monolingual among us to enjoy and appreciate the insight of writers they would otherwise never have discovered. When I was going to school, I look back and I guess the first global literature I was exposed to in school was, I am sure, Don Quixote. And back then it was about the only thing on the curriculum that you could really call global literature, at least at my school in the Deep South. Now, very commonly you will see, maybe not at the high school, but at least in the college level, you'll see Borges and Marquez and Isabel Allende, and and so many other writers that are coming to the forefront now, the next generation. I just think it's amazing and it's wonderful that that we are allowed to enter these worlds, even if we don't have the original language at our disposal, and of course many of us do not. Those of us who are lucky enough to be able to read, Nabokov in the original Russian and French, as well as English, are very fortunate. I can't do that, but I appreciate the fact that he is translated. I mean, that somebody as multilingual as he has reached that level of world literature where millions can read him in the original, and even more millions probably can read him in great translations. I think we're extremely fortunate. This wasn't always the case, and now with electronic worlds at our disposal, we also have the ability to run out and find it for our Kindles and get it immediately instead of having to send away. If we want to read it in real physical books, we've still got real physical beautiful books like the ones that Will brings to us, and other books, if you're like my husband and you will only read on a Kindle, well, by gum, you can get it there too. So.
Thanks. So the next question I want to ask is related to something Will was talking about and has mentioned a couple of times, which is about the publishing industry and how we have these big 5 publishers, and they let's say they promote and publish certain kinds of books that they think will sell by the bucketful. So let's talk about that for a second. And what I want to ask everyone is, given your work, what do you see as some of the more insidious industry gatekeeping problems or biases that are preventing a more inclusive canon of world literature? And what I mean by that is, I'll just be very candid about my own experiences. I had a book out last year. Most of my stories were set either in the South Asian diaspora or in South Asia, in India itself. And I did the usual thing, which is sent that book out to publishers, and it wasn't, the big 5 were obviously not, the agents and big 5 were not interested. I got a great, terrific indie press interested in, and the book did well with them. So I'm very happy. But we do see that when, for example, the big 5 do publish books from other parts of the world or set in other parts of the world, from what I see, where I'm sitting, I see them trying to check off certain tropes and stereotypes. Like with India, it'll be the slum saga, the arranged marriage plot, the terrorist fundamentalist, so talk about what you see from where you're sitting as an academic, a publisher, a critic, of what are some of these insidious gatekeeping biases and prejudices.
So, I mean, in the Latin American context, we just talked about Marquez. It's or at least for a very long time was magical realism, right? You have to write in a magical realist style to get attention on the international world literature market. Otherwise, you're not a Latin American writer. And I think that's changed a little bit, in part because a whole generation of Latin American writers were like, we hate magical realism and we're not gonna, write in that style at all. So that's, the first thing that comes to mind. But I think it's a really interesting question. And I think probably Will and Joyce will have more insightful things to say about it because they are closer to the publishing industry themselves. But another kind of example that pops to mind is my husband is from Turkey. He's also a professor at SMU. And so a lot of our Turkish friends are, academics, and they always complain about the fact that Orhan Pamuk is the one who got published, right? It should have been Yaşar Kemal, not Orhan Pamuk. But, Yaşar Kemal had a Swedish wife who did terrible translations into English of his work, so he didn't get translated and Pamuk did. So these kinds of things, I think every country is going to have that, right? When you're looking at your own favorites and your own, inclinations. And with the Latin American, it's the same, that, this whole generation of Latin American writers is like, we reject what the world thinks is Latin American writing, and we're going to do something different. So in that sense, it might be interesting to think about the ways in which world literature also reshapes, national literatures as upcoming writers kind of reject what the world has embraced as what they are.
Yeah, that's a really good point about how, the Orhan Pamuk argument. I've heard that before too, because not everybody in Turkey thinks of him as this great Nobel-winning writer. Will, how about you? What do you see as prejudices, biases?
I think I'm a gatekeeper now. So
you are.
Guard this question with a little bit of bias, right? But I still consider myself a reader first and foremost, right? And whether we publish 10 books a year or 50 books a year, out of the 400,000 books that come out in America every year, we are but a tiny fraction, and I'm still a reader of the greater whole. So I'm trying to answer it from both sides. So as a gatekeeper, I'm trying to confront these questions we're asking today, right? As a reader, I was influenced to become a gatekeeper because I was furious with these questions, because it was like, why do we allow it to be this way? And so interestingly, the more you dive into this stuff, there are writers who are untranslatable. Have you ever heard this? It's a fun question, right? Some of us who know foreign languages and things, you run into it all the time. Like, you can't translate Andrei Platonov. He's the untranslatable Russian writer. You can't get him to be as famous as anyone else because you just can't translate. He was working on another level. And then you have writers who write for translation, right? This is a modern practice especially, but it's always been a practice. You are writing for a more global understanding. Your work will be more translatable. If you are a writer in India, you want to get famous or rich from your work, that the much bigger market is outside of India than in India for your work, right? Sales will be higher in the UK. So how are you going to shape your story so that you can get out of your context? This is the same way in French, the same way in Swedish, same way in Turkish, same way in Russian. You have writers who write towards what we just called the stereotype. Nathan in the questions asked this exact same thing, like quality. As an editor, what defines quality to you? Because Elizabeth said garbage literature, which means this may be the new thing that we should start talking about. It's a great straw man argument, quality versus garbage, right? Like, what is the difference? There is a difference, but what is it and how do you define it? It should be a little bit different for everybody. But in these questions, as an editor, are you selecting books because they have this je ne sais quoi, or are you selecting books because they are like, they fit the stereotype of what you're going for? And in Russia, those are political books, right? Or Tolstoy, right? You have these meandering, gigantic Russian novels of ideas. And it hurts readers if that's all you get, right? It also hurts readers if you are an editor and you have to over-explain in the translation what's going on. You lose a little bit of the magic. And so that's a problem too. But then you have these classes of writers around the world who do get really famous and they're translated. You'll often see, this is something David Shields has talked about a lot in his books on translation and stuff. When you read like the back of a book and it'll be like translated into 27 languages, you'll notice that a lot of books have been translated into 27 languages. And then you ask yourself, what are the 27 languages that everyone has been translated into? And you can name them. They're the most popular languages in the world, right? The English, German, Spanish, French, you go down the list. That's kind of the canon, is those 27 languages out of the thousands in the world. And so if you're getting translated into those, it means that you have to have sort of a work that is easy enough to translate broadly, right? Ideally, this is kind of how it works. And so it leads to this total unequal flow. To me, the most interesting writers are the ones who reject those stereotypes, who play against them in some way. This is why we do what we do, right? In Latin America, you write magical realism, you write like Cortázar, or you write like Borges. Those are the three to me, right? And I'm a much bigger, I love all three, But, you know, it is funny to see that every culture kind of has these stereotypes for the writers who have gotten out and what gets to be. But yeah. Oh, and Nathan just mentioned in the comments too, only about novels. Let's not forget, fiction's but a tiny fraction of the written word. This conversation, I wish this panel was 2 hours long, guys. This is too good.
Thank you, Will. Yes. Joyce, how about you?
I think the great industry bias that I see as a reader and as a critic too is the assumption from the industry that readers only really want to read about people who are like them. This is a big problem, I think, because honestly, people like me are probably the last people I really want to read about. My life is pretty boring, and my background is probably nothing that I will ever be able to make an autobiography out of, much less a novel. So, but my feeling is that we need to remember that the human family is large and it's varied and it has a huge number of cultures in it, and our own culture is not the be all and it's not the end all. And we are better off remembering that. I think, sure, we like to read about people who have lives somewhat like ourselves because we can relate. But on the other hand, these lives that tell us about other people in the world, they tell us about other customs that, and lives and places we may never personally witness. You know, I may never make it to India. I may never make it to Africa or to the parts of South America I haven't seen yet. Many places that I will probably never get in my life, especially thank you, COVID. But on the other hand, they really come alive in my imagination. When I read your book, Jenny, it became so alive in my imagination. I still remember the story so vividly. And that is partly because you made them come alive. It made me feel like I was there. That's how we would hope that books would be. They bring us the world. If we open our eyes, if we open our minds and our hearts and realize we don't just always want to be reading about, you know, American people with American problems. There's so much more out there. And I feel like if people would open their hearts and minds and their brains a little bit and see that there is a wonderful, amazing number of places to go in your head.
Yep.
You don't have to get on a plane necessarily. I mean, it's great when you can. But I've discovered this last year, staying home.
Thank you for that. Yes, especially in the pandemic. Yes.
I can travel anywhere I want to go. But you know, it is a time machine and it's a traveling machine. The pages of a book, that's where I'm happiest. And when I can't get on a plane and go anywhere, I know I can always pick up a book and open it, and those pages will take me away. And I wish that everyone in the industry would realize that, yeah, we don't all necessarily need to always be reading about people like ourselves.
Well said. Let me jump real quick. We have a few more minutes left, so I'm going to jump to the questions in the chat. And Bethany had this really good question. How do we attract young readers? We have to build a pipeline. And so think of the different languages that are spoken in homes around the US. And, you know, how do we get them to reading about their own cultures? And that resonates with me. I've got nephews and nieces in the US who were born and raised here. They don't speak Gujarati. They don't read Gujarati. And I started translation initially just so they could read from our culture. So anybody want to take that? You know, Elizabeth, Will, Joyce?
I mean, I'll take it and just say a couple of things. One is, I mean, I think that that's a really interesting question, because this idea of, do we want to read about ourselves? Do we want to read about other people? I just saw, and excuse me if I butcher the pronunciation, but Zarmina's comment here on, as she says, as a brown woman, I have to say Latin American writers, women of the Harlem Renaissance, and contemporary Black writers are so important to my own reading and writing. And I think that, there is that, or as Jenny was saying with her nieces and nephews, if you don't see yourself represented in the broader culture all of the time, then reading about yourself can become a really kind of important rite of passage, right? And a really important way to understand your experience and see yourself in a richer way and a valued way. At the same time, I also am thinking genre fiction is one way to attract younger readers. And I say that primarily because my 9-year-old daughter has spent most of today sitting in a big chair reading a fantasy book that she, found online, and then we ordered her the paper version of it. But I think that any kind of experience where you get wrapped up in that story and then build those reading muscles, which is hard these days with all of the social media distractions.
Anybody else want to add to that? Will?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in there. I mean, obviously, when we talk about like Americans who look like us, you know what I mean, and not wanting it to be there, this is like a pretty white problem, because the books have traditionally been written by people of a certain socioeconomic status about certain types of socioeconomic status set in certain types of places. And so when I'm interested in reading, I'm interested in the American story of people who look a lot more like the places where I've lived, which I'm not constantly surrounded by people who look like me, right? Ever since I went off to college and realized how big the world was, the moment I stepped foot on a college campus, how lucky I was to realize how small I am. And that the more I'm able to engage with people where they come from and to find that shared ground, whether it's through food, stories, music, art in general, those are the things that really bring us together. And so I'm really grateful to my college for like being able to open up the world a little bit to me, for having such an international student body, right? And such a diverse student body from all the different Americas, because we always talk about America and American literature, but American literature will be a whole lot more interesting when we have a lot more writers of color, a lot more, just a lot more representation broadly of what America is, because America is Gujarati, and it is Latin, and it is Afro-Caribbean, and it is African, and it is Asian, and all these different things. We need to elevate all these stories to the same level that all those other white dude stories have been put on for so long. It's not that like white dudes are incapable of writing good stories. It's just, it's a whole lot more interesting when it's not the only one, right? Like that's what it's all about. Like let's level the playing field and have a lot more fun here and find the stories that resonate to us. Because like my path as a reader, I've never looked for books by people who look like me. Of course, they probably were all people who looked like me. But the book that I remember reading the most as a kid, and kids literature is not the thing for me. Like a lot of people really, like Beverly Cleary, rest in peace, she died yesterday. I read every book she wrote. None of her main characters were me, thank God, you know? And the other book that I really loved as a kid was Misty of Chincoteague, right? And Pippi Longstocking, a book in translation, I should add. And those are not characters who look like me, but I didn't even realize until I got there later, like, oh yeah, then a lot of these other ones, as I aged, it was like adult literature got a whole lot less interesting, right? And it's this aspect of how do we just bring more voices in? So publishing and the gatekeepers have a lot to do with that, because it's not just about publishers, it's then about who reviews it, which academics teach it, so that the canon it can be a lot more diverse. It can't just be publishers, because if 400,000 books are coming out every year, we have to kind of pick and choose what's worth sharing and talking about and getting added to future generations to be able to read too.
I wanted to just say one thing, and that's that in addition to genre fiction and so on, I think Elizabeth mentioned that, to get kids interested, you know what they would probably love? Graphic novels in their own language. That might grab them quicker than anything, especially boys, maybe, even more so. Give them a great graphic adventure based on some kind of interesting story, maybe from great literature, you know, and maybe that will help them get started. So.
Thank you for that. We literally only have a minute left, so I think we'll call it a day here with this panel, but I know we could have gone on for ages, and I had so many follow-ups I wanted to ask each one of you. But thank you so much, all of you, and everybody who attended and participated in the chat and asked questions. This was so great. It's a much needed topic, and I hope people will have more conversations about it. Thank you.
Thank you to the SMU Literary Festival for putting on a panel about reading the world. Thank you to Jenny for moderating it and sort of pitching it to the festival. But this is really how we hope build a better, it takes every aspect of society. So thank you, Sandria. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This was.
I wanted to.
I didn't get you, but I just.
Oh, go ahead. I wanted to say thank you, but we still have more programs to go. So please join us for the next program. And also, please go over to the website and buy the books. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Against that idea that